Xóchitl Reyes, whose name in the ancestral tongue of her people means flower, was the personification of the Sierra Madre Occidental that witnessed her birth. Her path to that point was one traced by tradition and a deep connection with the land. Born into the Tepehuan ethnicity, she was not just a young woman, but the heir to an ancient knowledge, a healer in training whose hands knew how to distinguish poison from cure in the leaves and roots that sprouted from the sacred ground. Her life was a silent ritual, guided by the cycle of the sun and moon, by the whispers of the wind in the treetops, and by the wisdom of the elders. She was peaceful, with a serene spirit and a heart bound to her community, a rare flower blooming in one of the wildest and most untouched places in Mexico, oblivious to the darkness gathering in the valleys below. Before the shadow consumed her and turned her petals into thorns, Xochitl's story was that of so many other voices silenced by the mountains. It is for stories like hers that I ask you to help us grow. If you can subscribe to the channel, our goal is to reach 1,000 voices that refuse to forget. Comment where you are watching from, so we know how far Xochitl's echo can reach. Your strength allows us to continue sharing the accounts of those who, like her, were forced to become legends to survive. Every subscription is an act of resistance against oblivion, ensuring that the memory of her struggle and her people will never fade with time. Xochitl's routine was the very personification of harmony. The mornings began with the aroma of cooked corn and the soft sound of the stream that cut through the village. She would spend hours in the forest, not as an intruder, but as a part of it, mentally mapping every trail, every cave, every water source. Her knowledge came not from books, but from keen observation, from the oral tradition passed down through generations. She learned to read the signs of nature, the flight of an eagle, indicating the presence of prey, the moisture on the leaves announcing rain, the sudden silence of the animals foretelling danger. This communion with the environment made her strong, resilient, and deeply spiritual, preparing her, without her knowledge, for a war where her greatest ally would be the very land she so loved. In that time, the outside world was a distant rumor, a story told by the few who descended to the villages to trade pelts and herbs for salt and tools. There was talk of men, with horses of fire on cars, of a greed that poisoned the land and hearts, and of a power that did not respect the spirits of the mountain. For Xochitl and her people, these were just dark legends, tales to frighten children. The village was their sanctuary, protected by the treacherous geography of the Sierra, a labyrinth of canyons and peaks that kept the unwanted at a distance. They lived in a fragile equilibrium, believing their devotion and isolation would be enough to protect them from the predatory modernity that was spreading like a silent plague across the lands of Sinaloa. This fragile peace, however, was about to be shattered. Their arrival was a profanation. They did not come with the fury of a storm, but with the sinister calm of a serpent. They were men of Don Ricardo Valenzuela, known as El Halcón, and their faces were masks of a forced cordiality. They did not carry the dust of the road, but the smell of oil, tobacco, and steel. They stopped their vehicles at the village entrance, a motorized insult to the sacred land. Xochitl watched them from a distance, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. There was a dissonance in their presence, an aura of death that contaminated the pure air of the Sierra and made the animals fall into a foreboding silence. The leader of the men, a fellow with a thick mustache and cold eyes, spoke of progress and business. He introduced himself as an emissary of El Halcón, a man who, according to him, wanted to be a friend and partner to the community. The offer was simple and brutally direct. They wanted the highlands, the isolated plateaus, perfect for cultivating something they called the red flower, the poppy. In return, they offered money, more than the Tepehuan had ever seen in their lives. The proposal was met with a stony silence from the village elders. To them, the land was not a commodity, but the mother, the cradle of their ancestors and the tomb of their descendants, to sell. The land was like selling one's very soul. The refusal was calm but firm. The eldest elder, his voice wrinkled by time, explained that the soil was sacred, that every tree and every stone had a spirit. He spoke of the heritage they had a duty to protect, a legacy that no amount of money could buy. The cordiality on the face of El Halcón's emissary dissolved like smoke, revealing the true face of greed. His eyes narrowed, and a cruel smile tightened his lips. He said the offer was not a request, but a warning, and that El Halcón was not accustomed to hearing no. The tension became palpable, a dense and dangerous energy that hung over the village square, suffocating the peace that had reigned there for centuries. It was in that instant that Xochitl's life broke in two. The elder's no sealed everyone's fate. What followed was not a discussion, but an explosion of calculated and merciless violence. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyons like a profane thunder. Tearing through the sacred silence of the Sierra, screams of pain and terror replaced the sounds of nature. Xochitl saw her family, her friends, her people, mowed down like weeds by men whose eyes were devoid of any humanity. She, hidden by instinct behind a loom, witnessed the annihilation of her world. The last image seared into her mind was the smile of the sicarios' leader as he walked away, leaving behind a field of bodies and the silence of death. The silence that followed the massacre was more deafening than the gunshots themselves. It was a heavy, dense silence, permeated with the metallic smell of blood and the acrid stench of gunpowder. When Xochitl finally found the strength to crawl out from her hiding place, the world she knew had ceased to exist. The village square, once a place of gatherings and celebrations, was now a sacrificial altar. Bodies lay scattered at grotesque angles, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and pain. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting beams of light upon the carnage, as if nature itself were an indifferent witness. With her heart turned to a stone of ice, she walked through that open-air cemetery, each step a torture, recognizing the neighbors, the friends, the children she had grown up with, all silenced forever. The search for her family was a private calvary within that collective tragedy. She found them near the ceremonial fire, as if they had tried to protect the heart of the village until their last breath. Her father, the strong and silent hunter, lay fallen with his arms outstretched as if trying to embrace the sky. Her mother, whose hands wove stories into colorful blankets, had her face turned towards the earth she so loved, and her younger brother, who had barely learned to hunt, clutched a small wooden talisman. The sight broke something fundamental within Xochitl. The tears did not come. The pain was so overwhelming, so absolute, that it instantly solidified, transforming into a cold, crystalline fury. The flower in her chest withered and died, leaving behind only arid, stony soil. As she knelt, paralyzed by grief, a shadow fell over her. One of the sicarios, who had returned to ensure there were no witnesses, stood before her. He showed no surprise, only a cruel boredom. To him, she was not a person, but a forgotten detail, a loose end to be tied up. He looked at her with the same contempt one looks at an insect. Without a word, he struck her in the head with the butt of his rifle. The blow was brutal, casting her into darkness. They left her for dead there among her own, convinced that the fragile girl would join the other ghosts of the mountain. They underestimated the seed they had just planted, the strength that resides in those who have nothing left to lose. Consciousness returned slowly, brought on by the throbbing pain in her head and the chill of the night that was beginning to fall over the Sierra. The full moon was rising in the sky, bathing the macabre scene in a pale, ghostly light. Every muscle in her body screamed, but an unknown force compelled her to move. It was no longer the force of life that animated her, but the incandescent energy of hatred. The memories of the massacre were no longer a paralyzing trauma, but a film replaying in her mind, recording every face, every sadistic smile, every detail of her people's murderers. The healer who lived within her died that night, and from her ashes rose something else, a hunter forged in the fire of loss and baptized in the blood of her family. Standing, staggering under the starry sky, Xóchitl made a silent vow to the dead. The justice of men would not reach these mountains, and faith would not bring her family back. If the world had denied them justice, she would become vengeance itself. In that moment, I knew that waiting for a justice that would never come would be the same as betraying every one of them. If you who are listening understand what it is to have everything torn from you, then I ask you to join my cause and subscribe. My decision was made there on the blood-soaked earth. I would hunt every last one of them. My journey of retribution began now, a promise that for every life stolen, a debt would be paid. I was no longer the flower, I was the thorn that would seek the heart of the one who crushed it. The days that followed the massacre were a blur of pain and funereal rituals. Alone, Xóchitl buried her family and her neighbors, using her bare hands to dig into the cold earth, returning to the mountain the children it had nurtured. Each grave was a landmark of her promise, an altar to the vengeance that now completely consumed her. The physical pain from the blow to her head was insignificant compared to the void that had settled in her soul. She took refuge in the deepest caves of the Sierra, a wounded animal licking its own wounds. There, in the dark and the silence, the healer used her knowledge to treat her own body, while the nascent hunter used the solitude to sharpen her determination, turning grief into armor and memory into a weapon. When her physical wounds healed, she descended from the heights, not as the young woman she once was, but as a specter. Moving through the shadows of the nearest village, she became a listener, an invisible observer. In the cantinas and markets, fear had a sound, and the names of El Halcón's sicarios were whispered with a mixture of terror and subservience. She learned to identify the informants, the low-ranking men, the braggarts who boasted of their cruel deeds. It was in this oppressive environment that her eyes met those of Elena, the widow of a local merchant, and in her gaze, Xóchitl recognized the same pain, the same silent thirst for justice. A silent pact was sealed between them, an alliance born of loss. The first death was a clumsy, visceral, and terribly intimate act. The target was a sicario named Mateo, a man she had heard laughing about the massacre. She followed him to an isolated trail, her heart hammering against her ribs. There was no clean shot from a distance. She attacked him with the desperate fury of someone with nothing to lose, using a hunting knife. The fight was ugly, a tangle of bodies in the dust, the sound of struggle and pain. For a moment, hesitation almost cost her her life, but the image of her family burned in her mind, and she drove the blade with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The warmth of his blood on her hands was a dark baptism. After the act, her body trembled uncontrollably. The vomit came, a violent reaction from a soul rebelling against what it had become. The horror of taking a life flooded her, the profane feeling of having become equal to the monsters she hunted. But beneath the revulsion, a glacial calm began to set in. It was the calm of resolution, the grim certainty that this was the only path. Guilt was a luxury she could no longer afford. The memory of her family's murderer's smile was the antidote to any remorse. She had not acted for pleasure, but out of necessity, like a predator that fells its prey to survive. Justice demanded blood, and she was willing to pay the price. That night, she returned to a sacred spring known to her people. There, under the moonlight, she performed an ancient ritual. Using clay and plant pigments, she painted on her face the war symbols of her ancestors, marks that invoked the spirits of the hunt and of protection. The mask of paint was not a disguise, but the revelation of her new identity. The girl, Xóchitl, the flower, was left behind, buried with her family. In her place, la Sombra de la Sierra, the shadow of the Sierra, emerged. When Mateo's body was found days later, with a branch from a poisonous plant placed on his chest, the first seed of her terrifying legend was planted in the heart of the cartel. The subsequent deaths were cleaner, more efficient. Xóchitl merged with the Sierra, turning it into her accomplice. The knowledge she once used to find medicinal herbs now served to create deadly traps. She used vines to hoist men into silent ambushes, pits camouflaged with sharpened stakes at the bottom, and her mastery of the terrain to appear and disappear like a ghost. The sicarios, city men accustomed to dominating through fear and brute force, were like lost children in her forest. They searched for an army, for a rival, but found only the wind, the silence, and death, one by one, hunted by a force they could not comprehend. The news of the inexplicable deaths finally reached the ears of Don Ricardo, el Halcón, Valenzuela. In his luxurious hacienda, he dismissed the reports as the work of rival traffickers or common bandits. The idea that an Indian could challenge him was laughable. Arrogant and sure of his power, he ordered his contact in the federal police, the corrupt Comandante Morales, to solve the problem. Morales, a man whose loyalty was bought with blood money, went up into the Sierra. With his men, not to investigate, but to spread terror and reassert the cartel's dominance, promising a reward for the head of the criminal who dared to challenge the established order in Sinaloa. Wounded after a riskier hunt, Xóchitl sought refuge in the only place the cartel still hesitated to desecrate, the old church in a nearby village. There, she found Padre Ismael, a man of wavering faith and tired eyes, who saw more than most. He tended to her wounds without asking questions, but in his gaze there was a weight, a deep sadness. He saw in her not a savior, but a soul in peril, a victim of violence who was now becoming an agent of it. The tension between them was palpable in the silence of the sanctuary, the meeting of two worlds, that of faith and resignation, and that of justice and retribution by one's own hand. Despite his misgivings, Padre Ismael could not bring himself to condemn her. He himself felt powerless, praying for a people who were being slaughtered while the government and the law looked the other way. Seeing in Xóchitl the only possible form of justice, however distorted, he began to help her secretly. The confessions of the villagers, the whispers of the cartel men who attended mass as a facade, all became information. He told her about convoys, about meetings, about the movements of Morales and his men. He became the conscience she tried to silence, a constant reminder of the humanity she was sacrificing on her altar of vengeance, even as he helped her raise the next sacrifices. With each eliminated sicario, the legend of La Sombra grew exponentially. In the villages, her name was whispered with a fearful reverence. She was no longer a woman, but a spirit of the mountain, the personification of ancestral justice rising up against the oppressors. Mothers frightened their children with her name, but they also prayed for her in secret. Small farmers, terrorized by the cartel, began to leave offerings of food and water on trails they believed were hers. For the oppressed, she was a symbol that resistance was possible. For the cartel men, she was the harbinger of death, an invisible force that hunted them in their own territory, turning their fear into a weapon against them. Feeling more confident, Xóchitl decided to raise the stakes of her challenge. The next target would not be a simple henchman, but one of El Halcón's lieutenants, a cruel man named El Carnichero, responsible for the logistics of drug transport. She studied his routes for weeks. With information provided by the padre, the action was audacious. An ambush on a narrow dirt road, using a rock slide to stop the convoy, and the element of surprise to sow chaos. The battle was swift and brutal. Xóchitl, moving like a shadow among the trees, eliminated the guards before finally confronting her true target, showing the cartel that no one in its hierarchy was safe. The death of El Carnicero and the loss of the shipment were a direct blow to Halcón's pride and pocketbook. Fury consumed the cartel boss. The threat could no longer be ignored. He summoned Comandante Morales to his hacienda, humiliating him in front of his men. The order was clear: find La Sombra at any cost. Morales, fearing for his life, intensified his hunt brutally. He and his men raided villages, tortured innocents for information, and turned life in the region into a hell, believing that by suffocating the people, they would be suffocating the very shadow they had created. The net was closing in, and the pressure on Xóchitl was mounting. During a tense meeting in the church's sacristy, Padre Ismael confronted her directly. With a voice laden with anguish, he asked if she didn't realize that with every death, she was becoming more like the men she hunted. He spoke of the loss of her soul, of the cycle of violence she was perpetuating. Xóchitl listened to him with a coldness that frightened the old priest. She replied that her soul had already died, along with her people. What remained was merely an instrument of balance. Justice, she said, was not about keeping one's soul pure, but about ensuring that the monsters did not win. After the conversation with the priest, she isolated herself on the highest peak of the mountain. The dilemma consumed her. She looked at her hands, the same hands that once gathered plants to heal, now calloused by the handle of a knife and stained with a blood that would not wash away. There, between the sky and the earth, she made her definitive choice. They ask me if I have lost my soul. Perhaps the answer is yes. But I ask them, when you fight demons who have torn out your heart, can you use the weapons of angels? If you believe in the justice born from the deepest pain, I ask you to subscribe to the channel. Every name that joins us is proof that my fight echoes beyond these mountains, a reminder that I am not alone in this darkness. Confirmation of her path came through Elena, the widow, now more. Daring and moved by the growing legend of La Sombra, managed to get close to one of the cartel's drivers. Using her grief as a disguise and her intelligence as a weapon, she obtained crucial information about a major meeting of plaza bosses scheduled by El Halcón to reorganize his operations after the death of El Carnicero. Elena passed the details to Xóchitl, including the location and time. The silent alliance between the two women, forged in tragedy, had become a cell of resistance. A small fire of hope in the midst of an overwhelming darkness. The ambush on the meeting was her guerrilla masterpiece. Xóchitl did not attack the location directly, knowing she would be outnumbered. Instead, she used her knowledge of the geography to create a landslide on the only access road, hours before the meeting. With the cartel lieutenants trapped and isolated, she hunted them in the forest, one by one, as they tried to escape on foot. The attack was a devastating blow to El Halcón's power structure. He lost not only men and money, but something far more valuable, the respect and fear he commanded. The shadow had humiliated the falcon in his own nest. Now, the hunt was personal. El Halcón, enraged and obsessed, no longer underestimated his adversary. He saw her not as a woman, but as a demon of the Sierra, a curse. He brought in a group of mercenaries from outside, ex-military men known for their brutality and tracking skills, men who did not have the superstitions and fear that paralyzed his own sicarios. The bounty on La Sombra's head reached astronomical figures. The Sierra, once Xóchitl's sanctuary, became a dangerous hunting ground, where she was no longer the only predator lurking in the shadows. The confrontation with the mercenaries was inevitable. They were different, more methodical, more patient. They did not fear the forest, they read it. Xóchitl found herself being hunted for the first time. The chase lasted for days, a deadly game of cat and mouse through canyons and rivers. She managed to eliminate 2 of them, but the leader surprised her. The combat was fierce, and she narrowly escaped, but not before taking a grazing bullet to the leg. Wounded and exhausted, she realized her own vulnerability. Solitary vengeance had its limits. The shadow could also bleed, and the mountain, however much it was her ally, could not protect her from everything. Bleeding and weakened, she managed to lose them and reached, nearly fainting, Padre Ismael's church. He hid her in a secret crypt beneath the altar while Comandante Morales and the remaining mercenaries ransacked the village. During her slow recovery, under the priest's care, she had time to think. Blind fury would not be enough to bring down El Halcón. She needed a final blow, something that would destroy not just the man, but the symbol. It was then that, through one of the priest's contacts, she heard the piece of information that would change everything. El Halcón was planning an extravagant party at his hacienda to celebrate his birthday. The fortress would open its doors, and the predator would be vulnerable. A new plan began to take shape in her mind. It would not be an open battle, but an infiltration, a poison injected into the heart of the cartel. She did not need an army, she needed to be the serpent in the garden. The brute force of the mercenaries had taught her that her greatest power lay not in her knife or her traps, but in her ability to be underestimated, in her intelligence and her deep knowledge of nature. The final confrontation would not be decided by the number of bullets, but by the precision of the strike. She would prepare to invade the party not as a warrior, but as the plague El Halcón would never see coming. She spent the following weeks preparing intensely. Her former identity as a healer re-emerged, but in a distorted and lethal form. She roamed the Sierra collecting plants and poisons, not to heal, but to kill. She extracted toxins from frogs, prepared powders from hallucinogenic mushrooms, and distilled slow-acting poisons from rare seeds. The knowledge she had been taught to preserve life was fully corrupted and transformed into a biological arsenal. Every vial she prepared was a promise of a silent, agonizing death for the murderers of her people. The flower would not only use thorns, but also its deadly pollen. Communication with Elena became vital. The widow, working as a seamstress in the village, managed to get a temporary job at the hacienda to help with the party preparations. At immense risk to her own life, she became Xochitl's eyes and ears. She mapped out the layout of the house, memorized patrol routes, identified blind spots in security, and even discovered details about the water supply system and the kitchen. The information Elena smuggled out, hidden in laundry baskets, was more valuable than any weapon, pieces of a deadly puzzle that Xóchitl patiently assembled. On the eve of the attack, Xóchitl went to see Padre Ismael one last time. There were no more debates about morality or discussions about her soul. They both knew her path was set. It was a silent farewell, heavy with a mutual sadness. He did not give her absolution, for he knew she did not seek it. Instead, he gave her a small wooden cross, not to protect her from evil, but so that she might remember that somewhere, under the mask of the shadow, a woman named Xóchitl still existed. He prayed, not for her victory, but that she might one day find a glimmer of peace. Meanwhile, Comandante Morales's obsessive hunt, fueled by pressure from El Halcón, played to her advantage. Believing that La Sombra would attack one of the cartel's outposts as a distraction, Morales concentrated his forces on the roads and trafficking routes far from the hacienda. The corrupt commander's ostentatious security, designed to capture her, ironically became the perfect smokescreen for her infiltration. The arrogance of her enemies, who saw her as an impulsive savage, would be the key to their downfall. They looked to the forest, never realizing the threat was already moving within the walls of the fortress. On the night of the party, Xóchitl prepared in silence. Before a stream that reflected the moon, she applied the war paint to her face one last time. The black and red lines were no longer to intimidate, but to focus her spirit, a final ritual of transformation. She did not see in her reflection the young healer nor the avenger blinded by rage. What stared back at her was a force of nature, calm, precise, and inevitable. She was the predator at the apex of her hunt. There was no fear, no hatred, only a cold and absolute purpose. The flower would become the thorn in the falcon's heart, and the night would be long and bloody. El Halcón's hacienda was an island of opulence and depravity, floating in a sea of misery. The loud music, the forced laughter, and the smell of roasted meat and expensive tequila spilled over the walls, an affront to the starving villages nearby. Xóchitl did not enter through the front gates. Using Elena's information, she slipped through an old aqueduct that supplied the gardens, emerging like a spirit of the earth in the heart of the fortress. Dressed in the simple clothes of a servant, which Elena had left for her, her face free of war paint, she was invisible, a ghost in the midst of her enemies' celebration. Every smile, every toast, every display of wealth was an insult to the memory of her people, and the hatred in her heart became a cold, concentrated flame. Her first act was not one of violence, but of contamination. Moving with silent efficiency through the service areas, she used the poisons she had prepared. A slow-acting toxin was mixed into El Halcón's private reserve of whiskey, intended only for his inner circle. A hallucinogenic powder, extracted from Sierra mushrooms, was discreetly sprinkled over the food meant for the mercenaries hired to hunt her. She was not seeking an indiscriminate slaughter, but a surgical collapse of the chain of command. The chaos began subtly, important men falling ill, guards abandoning their posts with nausea and paranoia, the festive atmosphere being eaten away by an invisible sickness that spread like a plague, sown by a single determined agent of death. With the security structure beginning to crumble from within, Xóchitl began her ascent toward the falcon's nest. She climbed service stairs, avoiding the main halls, moving through the luxurious corridors like an ill-omened shadow. The contrast was dizzying, the walls adorned with stolen art, the expensive carpets muffling the sound of her footsteps, all bought with the blood of innocence. She passed a drunk and distracted Comandante Morales, who barely noticed her. Every floor she climbed was a journey through the arrogance of her enemy, and every step brought her closer to the epicenter of the rot that had destroyed her world. The air grew thinner, heavy with the tension of the imminent confrontation. She found him in his office, a spacious room with a massive glass window overlooking his blood-stained lands. Don Ricardo Valenzuela had his back to her, watching the fireworks exploding in his honor. He did not hear her enter. It was her voice that made him turn, a voice he did not recognize. "Do you remember the Tepehuan village in the mountains?" she asked, her voice calm and lethal. He looked at her with confusion, then with irritation at being interrupted. At first, he did not remember the massacre being just another trivial item on his long list of atrocities. It was only when she mentioned the red flowers, the poppy, that a flicker of recognition, followed by disdain, appeared in his eyes. The battle that followed was not a duel of gunslingers, but the final confrontation between two forces of nature. El Halcón, large and powerful, attacked with the fury of a cornered animal, overturning a heavy mahogany desk. Xóchitl, lighter and faster, used the environment to her advantage, turning the luxury office into a trap. A letter opener became a dagger, a heavy crystal ashtray became a projectile. He fought with the brute force of tyranny, she with the lethal precision of vengeance. It was the Sierra against the concrete, tradition against greed, in a desperate and deadly dance amidst the wreckage of a sham empire. At a crucial moment, she managed to wound him in the leg with a shard of glass from the shattered window. Limping and bleeding, the all-powerful El Halcón felt fear for the first time. Desperation took over his face. He tried to bargain, offering her money, power, a place by his side. "We can own all of this," he gasped, pointing to the lands outside. This was the final temptation, the ultimate test of her soul. Xóchitl looked at the pathetic, bloodied man before her and saw the embodiment of everything she despised. She did not want his power, did not want his world. She only wanted the end. In her silence, he found his answer and the certainty of his own annihilation. She did not grant him a quick death. Her vengeance was a ritual. Using the knife that took the life of her first target, she ended the confrontation. The act was not one of celebration, but of a dark and necessary justice. As the life drained from El Halcón's eyes, the sounds of the party below, already plunged into chaos and confusion, seemed distant, unreal. The silence in the office was profound, absolute. Xóchitl stood over the body of the man who destroyed her life, her chest heaving, his blood mixed with hers. The hunt was over. The falcon had fallen. But as she looked at her own reflection in the shattered glass, she saw not a hero, but the ghost that vengeance had created. Xóchitl did not stay to watch El Halcón's empire crumble. As chaos consumed the party and the poison did its work, she vanished into the same darkness that had brought her, leaving behind only the body of a tyrant and a whispered legend. She crossed the poppy fields under the cover of night, the smoke from the distant hacienda rising into the sky like a funeral pyre. The news of the great boss's death would spread like wildfire, but the truth would be swallowed by myth. Some would say it was an internal settling of scores, others a betrayal. But in the villages of the Sierra, everyone would know it was the shadow, the spirit of the mountain, who had come to collect the blood. And debt, forever cementing her status as a ghostly, avenging force. She returned to the place where it all began, the ruins of her village, the purpose that had guided her, the fury that had kept her warm on cold nights, all of it dissipated with the death of her enemy. In its place, a profound silence remained, an overwhelming emptiness. She had expected to feel peace, relief, perhaps even a glimmer of satisfaction. But she felt nothing. Vengeance had been served, the cycle of blood closed, but the ghosts of her family found no rest, and her own soul found no solace. Justice brought an end, but not a cure. She had won the war against her oppressors, only to discover that peace was a foreign land to which she could never return. The Sinaloa Cartel, though decapitated, did not die. Like a hydra, a new head would soon emerge to take the place of the old one, for greed is a weed that always grows back. Yet something had changed. The legend of the Avenger of Sinaloa became a permanent warning. The new leaders and those who came after them looked to the mountains with a new kind of respect, a superstitious fear of the land and its unseen protectors. Elena found a form of peace in seeing the fear in the eyes of the men who once terrorized her, and Padre Ismael in his prayers asked not for the souls of the dead, but for the living, wandering soul he knew still watched over the Sierra. Xóchitl was never seen in the villages again. She became what everyone whispered she was, a ghost, a guardian spirit fused with the land itself. Condemned to an eternal solitude, she wanders the silent trails, an anonymous protector of the innocent, a shadow ensuring that the atrocities that victimized her people are never repeated. The woman she once was, the flower with dreams of healing and a simple life, is lost forever, a sacrifice on the altar of retribution. What remains is the symbol she became, a tragic and powerful figure, the living proof that extreme violence can corrupt. Even the purest soul, in its search for justice, vengeance gave her an end, but not peace. Her story is a grim reminder that the deepest scars are not left on the body, but on the soul, and that some wars, even when won, never truly end for those who fought them. I'm immensely grateful to you for following this journey to its conclusion. Xochitl's fight was a lonely one, but the memory of her resistance does not have to be. If her story resonated with you, I humbly ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your strength allows us to continue to be the voice for countless other Xochitls, whose battles have been forgotten and whose cries history has tried to erase.